Dear learners, welcome back to WSE English True Stories, where history meets language learning, and every word carries a journey. Today, we begin an extraordinary story, one that is not about a single person but about a living character that has shaped America and the world, Yale University. At first glance, Yale is a place of stone towers, leafy courtyards, and shining academic prestige. But behind those walls lies a tale of struggle, sacrifice, and vision. It began with Puritan dreams, carried forward by generations of students and teachers, and later gave birth to leaders, reformers, and even presidents of the United States. What we discover in this story is not just the rise of a university, but the spirit of resilience, the hunger for knowledge, and the courage to transform ideals into living institutions. This is not just a story about education. It is about ambition and adversity, conflict and hope. For English learners like you, every detail will bring not only new words and expressions but also deep inspiration. By the end, you may feel that the story of Yale is also a mirror, reflecting your own search for meaning, growth, and greatness. If you enjoy our work, please support us by liking, commenting, or sharing this video. Your encouragement helps us continue bringing stories that inspire and teach. So, get ready. The journey into Yale's soul, from Puritan dreams to Ivy prestige, begins now. The story of Yale begins not in the grand halls of New Haven, but in the fragile hopes of a people searching for permanence in a new world. In the 17th century, the Puritans had crossed the Atlantic, driven by dreams of creating a society built upon faith, order, and knowledge. They were not adventurers chasing gold or fortune, but believers determined to plant schools, churches, and communities that would shine as examples to the world. Yet life in the colonies was anything but easy. The land was wild, the winters harsh, and survival itself demanded every ounce of strength. Still, these settlers carried a conviction: if their society was to thrive, it needed strong leaders grounded in learning and morality. Education, they believed, was the foundation upon which both soul and state could stand. Out of this conviction grew the idea of a college, a place that would train ministers, teachers, and civic leaders who could guide the fragile colonies towards stability and greatness. Harvard College, founded in 1636, was the first seed of this vision. But as the decades passed, Puritan leaders in Connecticut felt the need for another institution, one that could safeguard their own traditions and ideals. They feared that learning might drift away from faith, and they wanted to ensure that their young men would be educated in an environment rooted in their values. In 1701, this desire gave birth to a bold decision. 10 ministers gathered in Branford, Connecticut, each placing a stack of their own books upon the table. This simple act, the gift of books, became the symbolic foundation of a new college. From these volumes, a flame of knowledge was lit, destined to grow into one of the most prestigious universities in the world. At first, the institution was small, fragile, and uncertain. It had no magnificent buildings, only a few students, and little money. But what it did have was vision, a determination to build not just a school, but a living guardian of values, knowledge, and leadership. From these humble beginnings, the journey of Yale began. Like the early settlers themselves, it faced hardship and doubt, but its roots were deep, nourished by the faith and resilience of its founders. And so, the stage was set. What began as a modest gathering of ministers would soon rise into a powerful institution, one that would face challenges, confront conflicts, and eventually leave a mark upon history itself. The dream of building a college was noble, but dreams alone cannot keep doors open, teachers paid, or students inspired. For the founders of what would later be called Yale, the first years were marked by uncertainty and fragile hope. The Puritan ministers had planted the seed, but the soil was rocky, and storms of doubt quickly gathered. The young college struggled with poverty. Its first leaders worked without proper salaries, often living in simple homes with few comforts. Books were precious, classrooms were plain, and student numbers were tiny. Every year brought the same haunting question: would the college survive another season, or would it fade into nothing, like so many small colonial projects before it? Beyond money, there was a greater problem: identity. What was this new school meant to become? Some saw it as merely a small seminary for training ministers, while others imagined it as a larger institution that could serve the whole colony. This clash of visions bred disagreement and confusion. Without clarity, even the most devoted students could sense that the college lacked a stable foundation. Tension also came from outside. Harvard already stood as the proud older brother, respected and recognized across the colonies. To many, the idea of another college seemed unnecessary, even presumptuous. Critics mocked the young institution, questioning whether a handful of ministers could ever build something to rival Harvard's legacy. Jealousies flared, and rivalry brewed between Massachusetts and Connecticut, each colony eager to protect its own cultural influence. Adding to the strain was the shifting tide of religion. By the early 18th century, some feared that the great zeal of the first Puritan settlers was fading. Churches were losing members, and the fires of faith no longer burned as brightly as before. The ministers who founded the college worried that without strict guidance, both society and learning would drift into moral decline. But in holding so tightly to orthodoxy, they risked alienating students who longed for broader horizons. Imagine being a student in those early days. You walked into classrooms without grandeur, sat on rough benches, studied from borrowed books, and wondered whether your diploma would carry meaning in a world that barely knew your college existed. At times, the atmosphere must have felt heavy, as if the very survival of the institution rested upon your shoulders. These were the first great challenges: poverty, rivalry, identity, and the slow erosion of the faith that had once inspired the founders. Each one threatened to crush the fragile college before it could truly rise. Yet history teaches us something powerful: greatness often begins in struggle. For Yale, the emerging problems did not destroy the dream, they refined it. The college would be forced to ask, what do we stand for? Who are we meant to become? And it was in answering these questions, through conflict and sacrifice, that Yale would move from a fragile beginning to a force that would shape the destiny of a nation. The early struggles of poverty and doubt could have ended the story. But instead, they became the fire that forged determination. The ministers who founded Yale, along with its early leaders, refused to let their fragile dream collapse. They believed that if their college was to stand, it had to rise above being merely a small, uncertain seminary. It needed purpose, protection, and prestige. One of the first decisive steps was to secure support from powerful allies. The college leaders looked beyond the colonies to England, where influence, wealth, and reputation could be found. They dreamed of an endowment that would not only fund their school but also give it an identity that commanded respect. This bold idea would lead to a dramatic journey across the ocean, and eventually to the name that would forever define the institution, Yale. In 1718, the trustees received a generous gift of books, money, and goods from Elihu Yale, a wealthy merchant connected to the British East India Company. Elihu Yale himself had never set foot in America, but his donation gave the struggling college both financial relief and something more powerful, a name with international recognition. With gratitude, the trustees renamed their institution Yale College. Suddenly, the fragile dream of 10 ministers had a new banner under which to march. But names and gifts alone could not solve every struggle. The college still faced deep rivalries and internal conflicts. There were heated debates about curriculum. Should the focus remain tightly bound to training ministers, or should the scope expand to philosophy, law, and the sciences? Some argued that too much learning would lead to dangerous pride and heresy, while others believed that without growth, Yale would remain small and irrelevant. It was a defining struggle, tradition against expansion, safety against ambition. At times, the tension felt unbearable. Students and teachers lived in a climate of both excitement and uncertainty, never fully sure which direction the college would take. Yet even in this storm, something remarkable happened. Yale began to form a distinct spirit. While Harvard leaned toward liberal thought, Yale became known for a firm, disciplined culture, often stricter in faith but also deeply committed to producing leaders with moral backbone. This contrast set Yale apart and attracted families who wanted their sons educated with both intellect and character. Step by step, the college grew. Classes expanded, small buildings were added, and traditions began to form. Students engaged in fierce debates, long hours of study, and even playful mischief that lightened the weight of their demanding education. Through these experiences, a sense of identity began to root itself. Yale was not simply surviving, it was becoming. Still, the journey was not without cost. Teachers sacrificed comfort, families gave donations they could barely afford, and students endured strict rules and harsh discipline. Yet these sacrifices built resilience, weaving a culture of endurance into the heart of the college. And in time, this endurance would be tested in far greater ways. For as the 18th century unfolded, America itself moved toward revolution. The colonies began to stir with questions of freedom, identity, and destiny. And in this rising storm, Yale would find itself at a turning point, a place where its students and leaders would no longer be able to remain in the quiet of classrooms, but would be called into the heat of history itself. By the middle of the 18th century, the air in the colonies was thick with unrest. The bonds that tied America to Britain were straining, and the echo of new words, liberty, independence, self-rule, spread like wildfire. In taverns, churches, and marketplaces, the great debate thundered: should the colonies remain loyal to the crown, or risk everything for freedom? Inside the walls of Yale, these questions were not distant. They were personal. Students and teachers alike were drawn into the storm of revolution. For the first time, Yale faced not only the test of survival as an institution but also the test of allegiance. Would it cling to its English roots, or would it throw its lot in with the fragile dream of a new nation? The turning point came when Yale's classrooms became breeding grounds for revolutionary thought. Young men who once recited Latin texts and studied theology now debated the meaning of liberty and justice. The fiery sermons of leaders like Jonathan Edwards and the bold speeches of political thinkers stirred restless hearts. Yale's campus became a microcosm of America itself, torn between loyalty and rebellion, faith and freedom, fear and hope. As tensions escalated into open conflict, many Yale students and graduates joined the Continental Army. They marched out not with books in their hands but with muskets on their shoulders. Some never returned, giving their lives on the battlefields of independence. Their sacrifice left an indelible mark on the college, proving that Yale was not a bystander to history but an active participant in the birth of a nation. The revolution was also a turning point for Yale's leadership. Presidents and professors had to guide their community through uncertainty, balancing loyalty to tradition with the necessity of change. At times, the college nearly collapsed under the weight of war. Supplies ran short, finances crumbled, and morale wavered. Imagine sitting in a classroom where lessons were interrupted by the distant sound of drums or gunfire, the shadow of war creeping into every lecture. But this crucible did something extraordinary. It reshaped Yale's identity. No longer merely a colonial outpost of English learning, the college began to see itself as American, a place not only for producing ministers and scholars but also for forming leaders of a free republic. The Revolution forced Yale to embrace a larger destiny, one tied to the fate of the nation itself. Out of this moment, a tradition of leadership was born. Over the decades that followed, Yale would produce presidents, senators, judges, and reformers who carried the spirit of that turning point into public life. The Revolution was not just a political upheaval. For Yale, it was a baptism of fire, marking the transition from fragile seminary to national institution. Yet even as victory came and America gained independence, the struggles did not vanish. The new nation was unstable, and Yale had to find its footing in a landscape filled with opportunity but also uncertainty. Would it rise as a beacon of American education, or would it falter in the face of new challenges? The Revolution had tested Yale's survival, but the next chapter would test its soul. The conflict had given it a mission, to produce not only men of knowledge but men of character, leaders who could guide a republic through storm and sunshine alike. And so, with independence won, Yale stood at the edge of a new journey. Its future would now depend on choices of sacrifice and vision, choices that would lead to the defining climax of its story. The Revolution had given Yale a new sense of purpose, but the decades that followed brought even greater storms. America was a young nation, bursting with energy but divided by deep questions: slavery, industrialization, democracy, and moral progress. Every institution was forced to decide where it stood, and Yale could not escape the conflict. The greatest test came during the 19th century, as the nation hurtled towards civil war. The question of slavery cut deep into American life, tearing apart families, communities, and even churches. At Yale, too, the debate raged. Professors, students, and alumni wrestled with conscience and conviction. Some defended tradition and compromise, others, inspired by the ideals of freedom, demanded abolition. The campus became a battlefield of words, where arguments carried the weight of moral destiny. This was Yale's crucible of choice. Would the college cling to the safety of neutrality, protecting its prestige but risking its soul? Or would it sacrifice comfort to stand on the side of justice, whatever the cost? Many of its graduates answered with action. Some became leaders in the abolitionist cause, speaking with courage against the chains of human bondage. Others marched into war, fighting not only for union but for the liberation of millions. In letters written from battlefields, Yale men spoke of duty, sacrifice, and faith in a higher calling. Too many never returned, their names etched into the memory of the college. Their deaths were not just losses for families but sacrifices that wove Yale's destiny into the larger fabric of a nation struggling for freedom. The Civil War itself shook the college to its core. Enrollment fell, resources dwindled, and grief hung heavy in its halls. Yet through the pain, a transformation occurred. Yale could no longer be seen as a quiet guardian of tradition. It was now an institution tested by fire, purified by the sacrifices of its sons. Its identity became inseparable from the fate of America itself. But the conflict was not only about slavery or war. Yale also wrestled with intellectual change. The 19th century was a time of scientific discovery, industrial revolution, and global exploration. Some feared that expanding too far into science and modern thought would betray the college's religious foundations. Others believed that refusing progress would doom it to irrelevance. This tension tore at Yale's heart. Here again came sacrifice and choice. Leaders risked criticism by expanding the curriculum, embracing science, law, and the arts, while still holding fast to moral training. Students were challenged not only to learn facts but to wrestle with values, to prepare for lives of service and responsibility. The sacrifices were real: heated disputes, broken friendships, and sometimes reputations lost. Yet from these struggles, Yale's vision widened, becoming not only a seminary of ministers but a forge for leaders in every field. This was the climax of Yale's conflict, not a single battle, but a series of choices that demanded courage. To remain safe would have meant decline. To embrace sacrifice meant pain but also growth. And Yale chose growth. It became a place where tradition and progress, faith and reason, discipline and freedom wrestled side by side, shaping a legacy that would echo far beyond its walls. Standing at this height of conflict, the words of its students and leaders often carried the weight of destiny. They spoke of ideals greater than themselves, of service that required giving everything, even life. Their sacrifices created a legacy not of comfort, but of character. And when the dust settled, Yale emerged transformed. It had been a school of Puritan ministers. It was now an American institution, hardened by struggle, enriched by sacrifice, and ready to lead a nation into its next chapter. From its crucible of conflict, Yale emerged not broken, but stronger. The sacrifices of the Revolution, the Civil War, and the long debates over faith and knowledge had carved into its character a resilience that few institutions could match. Now, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Yale began to harvest the fruits of that long struggle. Its graduates were everywhere. In courtrooms, in Congress, on battlefields, and in churches, Yale men carried the values of discipline, service, and leadership into the heart of America. The college had once dreamed of producing ministers and teachers for a fragile colony. Now it was producing presidents, reformers, inventors, writers, and entrepreneurs for a rising nation. Perhaps the clearest sign of Yale's victory was its influence on the highest office in the land. Over the years, several Yale graduates would sit in the White House: William Howard Taft, George H. W. Bush, and George W. Bush among them. Each represented not only personal ambition but the lasting ability of Yale to shape national leadership. When Americans elected a Yale man to the presidency, they were, in some sense, affirming the values the college had nurtured for centuries: service, responsibility, and vision. But Yale's achievements were not only political. The university also became a center of intellectual and cultural innovation. Its law school rose to international prominence, producing legal minds who shaped justice and policy. Its literary graduates, writers, poets, and critics enriched American letters with voices that challenged, inspired, and endured. Its scientists pushed the boundaries of discovery, contributing to medicine, technology, and understanding of the natural world. Even its traditions became achievements in themselves. From the haunting notes of Bulla Bulla to the fierce rivalries on football fields, from the quiet devotion of secret societies to the vibrant energy of student activism, Yale developed a culture both proud and playful. These traditions bound generations together, giving students a sense of belonging to something larger than themselves. And yet, the true victory of Yale was not in producing powerful men or grand traditions. Its real triumph lay in shaping character. Over centuries, it became known not only for intelligence but for integrity, not only for brilliance but for balance. The college that once teetered on the edge of survival had become a beacon of what education could mean, the blending of knowledge and virtue, of ambition and humility, of privilege and service. For English learners listening to this story, there is something deeply symbolic here. Yale's journey reminds us that greatness is not born in ease. It is born in trial, sacrifice, and perseverance. Victories that endure are not those of wealth or fame alone, but of character tested by fire. By the early 20th century, Yale stood tall among the Ivy League, no longer a fragile dream of Puritan ministers but a global symbol of excellence. The journey had been long, the conflicts sharp, the sacrifices painful. But out of them came a victory that gave Yale both prestige and purpose. And yet, the story did not end here. For what truly defines Yale is not only what it achieved, but what it left behind, a legacy that continues to speak, generation after generation. When we look back on Yale's long journey, we see more than the growth of a university. We see a story of vision and survival, of conflict and sacrifice, of victory and legacy. From its humble birth in 1701, when 10 Puritan ministers laid down their treasured books, to its role in shaping presidents and global leaders, Yale has stood as a mirror of America itself, fragile at first, then tested, then transformed into something enduring. The legacy of Yale is not simply in its stone towers, libraries, or traditions. Its true legacy lies in the ideals it has carried across centuries. The first is resilience, the ability to face hardship without surrender. Poverty, war, and criticism could have destroyed Yale, but instead, each trial became a stepping stone toward strength. The second is transformation, the courage to change when change was painful, to expand from a narrow seminary into a broad university that embraced science, art, and law while still holding to moral purpose. The third is leadership, the recognition that knowledge alone is not enough. Character must walk hand in hand with learning. From the Revolution to the Civil War, from the Industrial Age to the Digital Age, Yale has been a place where leaders are not only taught but tested. Its graduates have carried both brilliance and responsibility into the world, shaping the destiny of nations. And through them, the story of Yale continues. But perhaps the greatest lesson of Yale's journey is this: greatness requires sacrifice. Just as its founders gave their books, just as students gave their lives on battlefields, just as leaders gave their reputations in defense of truth, so too must every generation give something of itself to keep the flame alive. For you, dear learner, listening to this story, there is a question worth asking: what are you willing to sacrifice for the dream you carry? Yale's story reminds us that the path to greatness is never smooth, but every struggle, every act of courage, every moment of resilience builds a legacy that outlives us. And so, Yale's legacy is not only in the past, it is also an invitation. An invitation to live with vision, to act with integrity, and to pursue knowledge not for self alone, but for the service of others. In this way, the story of Yale is not only about a university. It is about the dream of humanity itself, to rise, to endure, and to pass on something greater than we received. Dear learners, we have walked together through centuries of history, from Puritan dreams to presidential legacies, from fragile beginnings to Ivy prestige. We have seen Yale survive poverty, rivalry, revolution, and war. We have witnessed its struggles with identity, its sacrifices for freedom, and its victories that shaped both America and the world. But more than history, this has been a journey of values. Yale's story tells us that true greatness is not measured only by towers of stone or names of presidents. It is measured by resilience in hardship, by courage in conflict, and by the willingness to sacrifice for a vision larger than oneself. The American president and Yale graduate William Howard Taft once said, "Don't write so that you can be understood, write so that you can't be misunderstood." In many ways, Yale itself has lived by this principle. Its legacy is clear, undeniable, and enduring. It speaks with a voice that challenges each of us to live with purpose and clarity. So let me ask you, in your own life, what legacy are you building? What values will you pass on, not only in words, but in actions that endure? If this story moved you, share it with others, carry forward the lessons of resilience, courage, and leadership. And if you'd like to support our work, please like, comment, and subscribe. Every gesture helps us continue creating stories that teach English and inspire hearts. Until next time, dear learners, keep learning, keep dreaming, and keep building a legacy that matters. Goodbye for now, and may the story of Yale continue to inspire your own journey.